Excuse me, can you take a photo of me?
Sure, but if you had the new Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 6, you could snap your own hands-free selfies.
Really?
Watch. I just flex it to the perfect angle, set it down, and FlexCam with Galaxy AI automatically zooms for the perfect shot.
Whoa.
Post-worthy.
New profile pic-worthy.
Flex the newest Galaxy AI Foldable Z Flip 6. Get yours now at Samsung.com. Samsung account login required. FlexCam length varies and is shorter than standard zoom length. Galaxy AI provided free until end of 2025 on supported devices.
Other realtors have vacant homes. At Pest Properties, ours come occupied and ready to invest. Looking to relocate your larvae? Try the Petri Residence. This rustic home features thousands of crevices to squirm in through, vaulted ceilings for our wall crawlers, and an outdoor bird bath teeming with mosquito eggs. So kick up your 6 hairy legs and sign today.
Before pests move in, Terminix it. With over 95 years of experience, we'll help keep your home off the pest market. Visit Terminix.com today.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least that was the plan. Except now the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want your connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Hello, 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 mega orderers. I'm Jason Pack, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to come to grips with the fundamental principles of our mad, 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 mad world. We also try to understand who is disordering the world and why. Many prominent disorderers are authoritarians or authoritarian wannabes. But if you want to get to the top of the league table and to become an arch mega disorderer in chief, we find that you have to be a tyrant. So from Vladimir Putin to Kim Jong-un to Xi Jinping, tyrants take a sledgehammer to the international order that liberal Democrats seek to uphold. Why is this? Why can't there be mega ordering tyrants? Maybe there could be, but there aren't. So today we're going to look at what keeps tyrants in power. Why do tyrants have to be so worried about losing power? How is it that fear of losing power governs the way that dictators govern? Our guest today is Marcel Dirsus. Marcel is an old friend of mine from St. Anthony's College at Oxford. He used to actually work for my consulting firm, Libya-Analysis. Marcel is the author of How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive. He writes the newsletter The 100, which is not to be confused with the cricket competition of the same name. And Dirsus has advised governments, foundations, multinational corporations, and international organizations like NATO and the OECD. Marcel, willkommen unter Unterordnung.
Thank you very much for having me, Jason.
Many tyrants espouse ideological justifications for their oppressive actions. You postulate that these ideologies are just covers, and that actually, if we look at tyrants, they're rational. They make hard-nosed decisions. They do what is best to stay in power. How do we know that?
Well, I think there is an argument to be made that ideology does play a role. But the argument of my book is that most of these leaders are rational. So we tend to have this image of these people as irrational madmen that are entirely immune to incentives. But that's just not what history shows, and that's just not what the data shows. In order to stay in power, all of these leaders have to make incredibly difficult trade-offs. And if they cease to be rational, and if they let themselves be guided by ideology, they're at imminent risk of losing power. Losing power is incredibly dangerous for these leaders. So when political scientists looked at the statistics and they studied what happens to personalist dictators after they leave power, they found that more than 2/3 of them have ended up in jail, in exile, or in a coffin.
So can we think of specific decision points, and then you look at a leader like Saddam Hussein or Hafiz al-Assad, Bashar al-Assad's father, or Muammar Qadhafi, and you can say he acted rationally here, but he just tried to make it look like he was acting ideologically. Can you give us kind of examples of how that plays out?
Yeah, so let me give you an example that I describe in the book. So when you look at somebody like Saddam Hussein, initially, as he was starting out, what he tried to do is really bring the internal threat under control. So if you're a tyrant, the first people that you need to look at are the people closest to you, because in these systems where power is very centralized, the main threat often originates from around the palace. It's the generals, it's the power brokers. So in order to survive in power, you really have to bring them under control. But then, as the threat shifted, and he increasingly perceived the prospect of a military defeat at the hands of the Iranian as the principal threat to his survival in power, he also shifted course. So when that war initially happened, almost the entire intelligence apparatus of the Iraqi state was focused on internal enemies. And in fact, when the war broke out, only 3 officers in the entire intelligence apparatus actually were directed at Iran. But then, as time shifted and the Iranians got the upper hand and it looked like they might actually make it to Baghdad, he shifted the way that he governed. So one thing that he did, for example, is become less involved in micromanagement. Initially, he very much didn't trust his own generals because he thought that they were the main threat. But then more and more he started listening to military advice because he thought, well, if I don't, then the Iranians might actually take me out. That said, you're right, of course, bluster is also a part of this because they're not just, tyrants are not just fighting real threats, but they're also trying to project an image of strength, perhaps also of a lack of predictability, but that's all really to keep people in check. But so the overall argument that I'm making is that this image of them as being irrational, of being mad, is convenient for us, but it doesn't correspond to reality in the vast majority of cases.
What you're getting at here is that your work is a key corrective to popular misconceptions about tyranny. I would say that all the misconceptions that you're trying to debunk are ones that either I have myself been trying to debunk or I have seen in my life in dictatorial regimes that the popular misconception is wrong. Popular wisdom is that Putin or the kings of Saudi Arabia or a given African strongman holds absolute power. But of course they don't. You can't be one individual and govern all of Russia. You know what I mean? The idea that the king of Saudi Arabia, he is, an autocrat beyond anyone's ability to constrain him. That's absolutely absurd because he needs his cousins and his brothers and his clan members. And then beyond that, they need members of society, military officers, doctors, scientists, engineers. All regimes, no matter how centralized, and Hitler is a great example of this, it only worked because the committed cadres were extremely committed to doing whatever thing that the Führer said. They didn't analyze if it was rational or crazy, but they did it. And if the military officers and scientists and engineers all of a sudden said, we're not doing this, the regime wouldn't work. Why do people believe that the Führer ruled all of Germany and Putin rules all of Russia? Why do they believe that?
It's a good question. I think a large part of this is that it's comfortable. It's comfortable for us to blame one man, to think of it as this unitary system with one person at the top who snaps his finger and then whatever he wants to happen magically happens. But that's not the reality. And what you describe, I think, is exactly right. So the more democratic your system becomes, the more people you have to convince to support you in order to stay in power. So that means that if you rule a system like Kim Jong-un's North Korea, you only need a very small share of the population on your side in order to maintain power. Which sounds good, but there's also a flip side of this. Because if you're somebody like, let's say, Olaf Scholz in Germany, and you're a democratically elected chancellor, you can lose a lot of people and still maintain power. But if you're Kim Jong-un and you lose, 100 of the wrong people, you're toast. So really, I think it's even worse than some people imagine in that sense, because these people also reliant on just a small number of people in order to maintain their power.
Let's make this more concrete to use the terms that you use in the book, the selectorate. So the selectorate in the United States, which people may understand better than the German system, is 100,000 voters spread between Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Arizona. You lose them, you lose the next election. Very clear, right? You don't have that 100,000 in those swing states, you're toast. And in Putin's Russia, it might be a few key oligarchs who control Rosneft and Surgutnefti gas, but then also the generals, and then also For example, Ramzan Kadyrov, because Chechen mercenaries are so important to your system. So if, for example, Ramzan Kadyrov and then one or two oil oligarchs, they don't want to play ball, and Mishustin is like, I'm not doing this order, Putin is done, right? He has just 8 or 9 key people in his selectorate, and if they are like, we're not doing it, Putin would be done, right? So what I want to get at is you and I understand this implicitly. That's the selectorate, right? And it could be broader, the 100,000 people in Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, or it could be narrower, the 10 oligarchs and generals and key fixers in Russia. Why do 90% of people, particularly those who live in these authoritarian regimes, believe it's just the top man? Putin decides.
Yeah, like I said, I think some of it is about comfort, but it's also, of course, about propaganda. It's also about what these regimes want you to believe. Because, of course, if you have Vladimir Putin, you want to project an image of invincibility, you want to project an image of strength, and you want your face to be, in every post office, on TV all the time, and you want your voice to be on radio. So they want you to believe this. And I think in these regimes in particular, that's a large part of the reason why a lot of people do believe it.
And the more you can convince people that the authoritarian tyranny is actually run by one superhuman person, it deters them from working together to overthrow him. It's very, very difficult for the average Russian citizen to either kill Putin or influence Putin. But if they understood that these 10 oligarchs, but also the doctors and the military professionals are really needed for the system to work, if they grasped that there were these choke points, they could work on those choke points. So it's critical to just say, no, it's all at the top of the pyramid and there's nothing you can do about it.
Exactly, and some rulers have taken this to extremes. And I cited an example in the book where a ruler in Haiti made himself look like a deity that was capable of reading people's minds. And of course, if you think that the ruler you're thinking about opposing is a deity that can read your mind, before you even take action, you're not going to try to do anything because it would be suicidal. And you see something similar also in North Korea, where the Kims are not just rulers, but they are some godlike figure. And that obviously makes it a lot less likely that people will even think about opposing them.
One of the things you illustrate brilliantly to my eyes is how this phenomenon of the cult of personality of the dictator needs very much to operate on those closest to him and not just on the peasants in the periphery. And this is something that I really experienced in Syria and Libya. And although I love talking about myself on my own podcast, this is about you. So I'm going to draw on the episode in your book where Catherine the Great was able to overthrow her husband. And she could overthrow her husband because the selectorate in that case was the imperial guards. And these were middle to upper middle class guys on horses who, for whatever reason, they liked her and they trusted her and they disliked the cheating husband. So can you tell us, how does a cult of personality work on this elite selectorate, be it the Imperial Praetorian Guard or whoever it might need to work on?
Yeah, so to just give you one statistic. So between 1950 and 2012, when 473 authoritarian leaders lost power. And out of those, 65% were removed by regime insiders. So what you described for Russia in the time of Catherine the Great still applies today. The people around the leader are usually the biggest threat. And there are two elements to this. I think one is the cult of personality that these leaders try to imbue not just in the masses, but also in the elites. And then the elites, of course, also have the capability for rational thought, right? So they do try to convince them that they are deities, that they are invincible, that they cannot be opposed, and that it would be suicidal to even try anything. But at the same time, of course, these people also have interests. Since these are the people that keep the rulers in power, the ruler needs to manage them. And one way of doing that is the carrot, and one is the stick. So in an ideal scenario, you want to convince these elites that supporting you will lead to wealth, will lead to power, not just now, but also in 5 years or in 10 years. And if that doesn't work, you always have the stick, which is repression. But the problem with repression is that you cannot use it endlessly. So, sometimes I think people in democracies, they think, well, why doesn't Putin just kill everybody? Or, why doesn't she just kill everybody? The problem with killing everybody is that if you kill too many people, the people sitting around that cabinet table will eventually say, well, if we don't do anything now, we're going to die. And that is a very powerful motivator for them to try to get together and overthrow that leader. So purging, as it were, is really as much an art as it is a science.
Let's talk about how these ideologies and cults of personalities work, right? So you need to convince your selectorate to be loyal and your opponents that you have these great powers and that you're going to be able to defeat them. How does this lead to your running your society in suboptimal ways? Optimal maybe to stay in power, but suboptimal to, for example, increase GDP or maximize exports or even defend yourself against external enemies, or to coordinate with people on climate change?
There's an inevitable trade-off here, because as society becomes less democratic and you have to look after fewer and fewer people in order to maintain power, you're going to govern accordingly. So when money comes in, you're not going to use it to build a school in the countryside or do something else for the people that really don't matter to you. You're going to channel that money, you're going to channel that power and give it to the people that are already rich and already powerful, because these are the people that keep you where you are. But as you take care of those people, you're inevitably opening up yourself to some other problems down the line. And that relates to military effectiveness, that relates to the prospect of popular protests, and a lot of other things that can end up bringing you down. So to mention just one of these, let's go through military effectiveness. So as you look after your military men, the men with guns, you're inevitably making your military less effective. And let me explain what I mean by that. So if you're a democratic leader, your military is usually designed in order to protect the country or to go abroad and achieve some interest that the country may have. But if you're a dictator, the military is primarily a threat. Because throughout history, so many of these leaders have been brought down by the generals, by the men with guns, what they primarily want to do is ensure that it doesn't happen to them. And one of the things that they do in order to prevent this from happening is to restructure the military. So instead of having a unitary military that is effective at its core job of fighting wars, you might have a regular military and a large militia force. And you have a militarized palace guard, and you might also have a national guard. And the reason why they do that is because they want to make sure that no single general can overthrow them. They always want to have a scenario where anybody with a gun that might think about toppling them would have to go through others. And they repeat this for the intelligence services as well. So you don't have one intelligence service, you have multiple, and they all have overlapping responsibilities, and they all make sure that none of the other intelligence agents tries anything. That would be great if you want to prevent coups, but that is not great if you actually want to win wars.
You create these different institutions, some economic and some military, that compete with each other in non-functional ways. So that may help the leader stay in power, but doesn't it create so much internal disorder that the economy doesn't function? And how do we have a situation like in China where we're having increasing authoritarianism from Deng Xiaoping towards Xi, and certainly within Xi's term, the Chinese state gets more oppressive, more spying on its citizens over time, but the economy functions and Chinese institutions seem to do reasonably well. Is that a counter case, or am I missing something?
China is unusual in some ways. And of course, for every China, you have one country that is doing very badly on its path to becoming more authoritarian. But yes, I agree. In China, what we do see is this economic growth and strong economic performance combined with the country becoming more authoritarian. I think part of the reason is because even though Xi Jinping is obviously trying to consolidate power, there is still a lot that keeps him in check and that keeps him constrained. So some people are now arguing that Xi is really a personalist dictator, but the CCP started out as a one-party state, right? So, and whenever you have these one-party states, there are at least some checks on the power of the leader, and I think that makes quite a difference. The other thing that I would say, though, is I think in a way it's too early to tell. Maybe in 10 years, if we meet again, we're going to look back and we're going to say this started a huge descent in the fortunes of China because she consolidated power.
I do think we run the risk of oversimplifying this analysis that dictatorships inherently lead towards more totalitarianism and internal dysfunction over time, because, of course, there can be countervailing forces within the elite and others who make calculations for longer-term stability so as not to put at risk their futures, right?
No, I agree with you. I don't think it's inevitable that all of these regimes are on that path. But what I'm saying is that most of these leaders will march towards that direction if they can get away with it. If they're being held back by the elites that keep them in power and they can't get there, sure. But I think if you look at China, you see that Xi Jinping wants to consolidate power around himself. And thus far, he seems to be quite successful in doing so. Perhaps the people that keep him in power will change course when they see that, it's creating disaster. But so far, that doesn't seem to have happened.
A lot of this seems to do with the loyalty of the closest advisors, that your study of tyranny as a form is that to appease the selectorate, which is just those who can keep the leader in power, you really have to be good to those closest to the ruler, whether they're the palace guards or the oligarchs or the generals. Looking at things that way, what does that tell us about how Putin stays in power? And what is that telling us about the difficulties that Trump had with loyalty from his closest advisors during his first term? He was constantly busy having to fire people from, Milley to Scaramucci to Rex Tillerson. What can we learn about that?
Trump, I think, had the disadvantage that he can't send people to a Siberian gulag. And obviously that makes it a lot more difficult to keep people in line. Because, you can either please the people around you or you can keep them in line by threatening them. And that is exactly what Putin does. So either they stay in line or there's some cost. And if they do stay in line, then there's a reward. But the problem that somebody like Putin has is that he can never quite be sure who is genuinely loyal and who is just pretending to be. And in that scenario where the stakes are so high and he knows that he could get killed if he loses power, he has a massive incentive to promote according to loyalty and not according to competence. Because he doesn't want to die. So that's why he surrounds himself with yes men. But as you surround yourself with yes men, you start to make catastrophic decisions. And I would argue that part of the reasons why the Russians did launch the full-scale invasion of Ukraine is because the flow of information in these types of systems tends to be terrible.
What about what this says about how does Putin stay in power? Do you know what I mean? Because he's gotten all this bad advice and he's made other catastrophic decisions, but he's still in power. And it's 23 or 25 years into his reign, depending on how we look at it.
It's a tough thing to do, but I think the people around him probably calculate that they're better off with him in power than they would be trying to topple him. And that's not surprising because there's not really an obvious alternative. So, if you were to start opposing him, it's not clear that there's any reasonable chance of success. And if things do go wrong, you are most likely going to die. And he does, I think the depressing reality is that Putin does create positive outcomes for some people in Russia. So it's not as if everybody in Russia is miserable. Putin has made some people very rich and very powerful, and these people are not going to risk everything on the hunch that they might be able to get rid of him.
Let's pivot slightly and talk about a topic which is close to me, you, our mutual friend Brian Klaas, and this is the psychology of dictators and disorderers. In your book, you quote the very aptly named Dr. Gerald Post of the CIA analyzing Saddam Hussein in his testimony to the House Armed Services Committee. He talks about Saddam as a malignant narcissist who was oversensitive to criticism and lacking in empathy, but also highly paranoid. I'm thinking, oh my God, is he describing Trump or is he describing Saddam Hussein? And then if you extrapolate out, isn't it because this is what it takes to be a tyrant? And I think that there are some paradoxes here. We can each understand why lacking empathy is good to being a tyrant, because you need to crush your enemies, right? So it's good to not empathize with the Kurds because you need to try to just crush them. You understand why it's good to be paranoid because you need to be afraid, like, oh my God, what if my own generals are going to stab me in the back? What if, in fact, the Iranians are planning an attack? So paranoid is good. But why is deeply sensitive to criticism something that seems to be selected for in dictators? Because the amazing thing about Trump is you can get under his skin by calling him names or saying that it takes him a half hour to put on his hair or he's like a woman with the amount of makeup he wears. Literally, he gets pissed off with these slight insults. And then when I was reading Gerald Post's analysis of Saddam, I'm thinking this must be something that dictators share and are selected for. Why?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, like you say, the other ones obviously make sense. I think when it comes to the inability to take criticism, it might be about the structure of these regimes, because you have to, I mean, it's not an advantage to be annoyed by every little criticism, but you do want to create an environment where people don't want to criticize you, because you need that perception of invincibility and you need that perception of strength. And as weird as it sounds, not allowing even those smallest criticisms can be seen as a sign of strength in those regimes, even though we would probably see it as a weakness. You know, we would say, oh, you know, how that's pathetic. You know, you can't take a joke. But I think in some of these systems, not allowing even that small bit of criticism can be an advantage.
I'm going to tell a little anecdote from my ride to the airport in Nantes after going to the Olympics there. My cabbie was a Tunisian guy, Tunisian French, but born in Tunisia. And, you know, we started chatting in French until I realized it would behoove me to speak to him in Arabic. And he leads with, I don't follow politics very much. And I said, oh, what do you know about Al-Fahamdi? I had her on my podcast. She's the most important opposition politician in Tunisia. Never heard of her. I said, really? You've never heard of her? Oh, yeah, I don't know about the politicians in Tunisia. Interesting. What do you feel about Qais Said? I like him. Why? He's strong. He's a man. Really? Are you concerned about the fact that, for example, he's tossing up in the Tunisian economy to China and Russia and other states that are traditionally enemies of Tunisia? No. Putin is a man. Xi is a man. They're strong leaders. I don't care if Qais Said grows the economy, hurts the economy, brings more tourism, brings less tourism. I just want him to be a man, to be strong. And what I found fascinating is that this is just such an unfiltered example of why neopopulism appeals to certain kinds of people. A guy who did not know that there were elections in Tunisia in October. I told him, you know, there's these Tunisian elections. He was not aware. You know, he's living in Nantes. He doesn't vote in these Tunisian elections. He didn't know they were happening. I think that there's so much that we can draw from this about how dictatorships and neopopulist regimes work. So break it down for me.
You know, I agree. And I think for a lot of people in the West, that stands in contrast to the way that they see their own societies. You know, so they see these seemingly strong leaders in Putin or Xi Jinping, and then they look around and they look at their own systems of government, and nothing seems to work. There's not enough doctors. Roads don't get repaired. The government is struggling to build something as simple as an airport. And then in contrast, you know, what some of these other systems are doing seems very appealing. But I think reality is that these other systems are a lot more fragile than we give them credit for, at least in many cases. Obviously, there are outliers such as China, but the vast majority of these non-democratic systems are not like China, and they're not even like Putin's Russia either. A lot of these countries are plagued by insecurity. You have frequent coups. You might have rebellions. You might have the government not having full control over the territory even, although I guess that's also true for Putin's Russia now. So I think what is important is also that contrast. There's a strong psychological appeal to strength, but also it's in contrast to what people see, the type of weaknesses that they see in our own societies.
Great. So then we understand that Iran, Russia, some bogus, corrupt African regime like Equatorial Guinea, they're much, much less stable than is apparent, and even Venezuela. But how does that help us as policymakers? If we want to order the disorder, how can we use this insight?
I think everything starts with a realistic understanding of the way that these regimes function. Because oftentimes the way that we view them is either as these superpowers that are impossible to topple, that are incredibly stable. And other times we look at them as almost too weak, as if they couldn't do anything really, as if they couldn't become a threat either. So I think that the first point that we need to get at is to understand these regimes more accurately and for what they are. And that's relevant not just in foreign policy, but it's also relevant in something like development aid, right? Where I think a lot of policy is made not on the basis of what is actually realistic, but what we would like to see. And I think once we have this more accurate perception of the way that these regimes work, we really have to ask ourselves, okay, what do we want and what are we willing to spend to make it happen? Because just as staying in power involves trade-offs for these dictators, dealing with them involves trade-offs for us, because nothing is cost-free. You know, and I think in the real world, obviously, Western liberal democracies have an interest in promoting democracy, but that's not the only interest. Perhaps there's a military base we really need. Perhaps we need access to natural resources. Perhaps we need to control some maritime choke point. So I think all this is quite difficult, but it all starts with understanding reality as it is.
Oh, calling a spade is one of the critical things that we lack in today's world. But what's the take-home lesson? Is it that the U.S. or Israel could topple the Iranian regime, and that's actually a lot easier than having to fight Hezbollah? Or is it that we just need to have a fairer discussion about how to work with the dissidents who oppose that Iranian regime? I'm not sure I'm getting at the lesson here.
Yeah, I think my lesson is we have to be honest about the pros and cons of different policies, because I think a lot of the time we present policies as inevitable, right? So I think we do things oftentimes either because they've always been done this way or because they have to be done this way. And I think if we were a bit more honest about the pros and cons of the things that we are pursuing, we could get to a lot better policy. Now, I'm not going to say that we should always try to topple every tyrant, because sometimes, of course, the risks are going to be prohibitively high. But I do think, generally speaking, the West has an interest in promoting democracy because we have a competitive advantage in dealing with other democracies.
And our coordination complexities, which underlie the era of global enduring disorder, would be solved if we had other democracies to coordinate with. Yes, France and Italy are bad at coordinating, and this is something that hurts me deeply, that they could be on opposite sides of the Libyan civil war, that France and Italy could have very different approaches to migration that undermines the EU's ability to have migration, but still, they can coordinate better than we can with Kazakhstan or Russia, right? So it would behoove us to have more of those regimes in place.
And I think also when we deal with non-democracies, regimes like Russia and China have competitive advantages. And in some areas, they're just difficult to beat. So if we're dealing with, let's say, an African dictatorship, because of our morals and because of our laws, we cannot really coup-proof them, right? I mean, during the Cold War, sometimes this happened. But right now, it'd be quite difficult for a Western government to, fight a coup on behalf of some African dictator. But the Russians can do it. So ultimately, I think the argument in favor of promoting democracy is not just an argument based on morality, but it's an argument based on interest. I think the world will become more ordered if there are more democracies. So we should promote democracies, but we have to pick and choose our battles. And the truth is that not every tyrant presents the same problem to us. There are some tyrants that are an issue in a moral sense, but they don't touch our interests in the same way as somebody like Putin. So we have to see what we can realistically do with the capabilities we have and how much risk we're willing to take.
To come back to, I think, the essential point for the Disorder program is that your book, How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive, gets at an essential and obvious truth about dictatorships. I'm going to call it the endless quest for security. There's a famous book by Nadav Safran about the Saudi monarchy. He calls it The Endless Quest for Security. And I ended up thinking, this is a great title. I want to steal his title for what I'm going to call the Dirsus thesis, which is that all non-democratic regimes are essentially endlessly engaging in a quest for regime survival. And it has always been thus, and it will always be thus. It unites the Roman Empire with Putin's Russia, with the most dysfunctional kleptocratic DRC in the Congo. What they are trying to do is to constantly stay in power. So let's take this lesson. This is a great lesson. People have known it, but it's not foregrounded enough. What does this tell us about how our world has gotten more disordered in the last 2 decades?
Obviously, if your regime is structured in such a way that you prioritize regime survival above all else, and you constantly seek the security, it's going to have an impact on your neighbors. It's going to have an impact on the countries around you, because you might think that your security cannot be guaranteed as a regime if the regimes around you are powerful. It might have to be guaranteed against these other countries, so that inevitably creates a lot of instability. And also, I think a point that doesn't get enough attention is how these regimes tend to cooperate. So when you have dictators in Africa getting support by Wagner, when you have the Iranian regime supporting the Russian war effort, when you have the North Korean regime supporting the Russian war effort. Now, obviously, they're not supporting each other out of the kindness of their heart. And I would personally argue that it's also not really an ideological element, But once again, I believe it is about regime security. So you have a direct impact between these dictators wanting to stay in their palaces and wanting to stay alive, and all this disorder and all this instability and all this killing in the world.
100%. I love it. That analysis is extremely clear. Let's expand a little bit more on the ideological versus regime security aspect of things. How does understanding that tyrants are primarily obsessed with regime survival help us contain their disordering effects better? Like, if we know that Putin just wants to stay in power and probably doesn't give a shit about conquering Ukrainian territory, can that give orderers a leg up in dealing with him?
The book is an argument in favor of the importance of this idea that tyrants want to stay in power and that determines their thinking and the way they govern. That said, I think it's obviously not the entire truth. I mean, obviously, all these leaders also have personal political preferences, they have ideologies, they might care about their place in history and so forth. So it's not to say that this doesn't play a role at all. I just think the role that it plays is something that gets way too much attention, and we don't think enough about this aspect of regime survival. And I think to the sense that it informs us, I think it allows us to make better policies through this prism of, okay, how does that influence this leader's perception of his security? Not of national security, but of his personal security. So when you look at something like Ukraine and you look at Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and I see people discussing NATO expansion, it makes very little sense to me, because ultimately whether NATO expands or not is not going to determine whether Putin stays in power or not. So I don't think this is the deciding factor that leads him to do much of anything.
Let us now move on to an agreeable disagreement, which we need to have a little disorder in our own pod. I am going to assert that some tyrants truly, hand on heart, believe in their ideology and even put it ahead of regime survival. And because of the true belief, may actually achieve more regime survival than someone who is merely rationally tallying up the X's and O's and making a decision, what at this moment has me stay in power. So let us consider Qadhafi. He funded the IRA. He funded the Sandinistas. He promoted terrorist acts like the Berlin disco bombing of U.S. service personnel. No self-preserving rational dictator would be like, what helps me is funding the IRA to attack Thatcher, and while Reagan is the most powerful man on the world, attacking American military personnel in Berlin. Those things almost led to regime decapitation. Reagan launched a military strike on Qadhafi's compound. He almost got killed. Thatcher kicked out her ambassadors and tried to also have a regime change against Qadhafi. The only analysis here is that he did them out of conviction. It can't be he was just trying to signal how badass he was. Qadhafi was the quintessential example of a purely ideological dictator. He believed every word, hook, line, and sinker, and he thought, I am here on this earth to fight these liberation movements and to have this bizarre economic system and to bring into being the third universal theory. So I see him as a very bad example for the idea that, dictators rationally calculate.
Yeah, I don't think I entirely disagree. What I would say, though, is that I think humans are complex, and I think these leaders, and probably us as well, sort of have the capacity to be both rational and irrational at the same time. So I think you can be rational much of the time and try to think through ways of how you can stay in power and how you have to structure your military and how you have to structure society. But then you can also have some areas where you're just really committed to some ideology and you just say, okay, well, to hell with it. Let's do it. And I think you're right to say that ideology does play a role for some of these leaders. And like you say, certainly it sounds like that's the case for Qadhafi.
I also make it as a huge distinction relative to, say, Saddam Hussein or Hafez al-Assad. He was an Arab nationalist, Hafez al-Assad, but he supported Iran against his fellow Arab regime, Iraq. He was a Ba'athist, but he tried to undermine Saddam, who was a Ba'athist. He did what he needed to stay in power. The fascinating distinction is relative to Qadhafi, who did many, many actions, particularly in Libya's economy, which made it less likely that he would stay in power. And I would assert that's because he was a true believer.
Yeah, so one thing that I've often asked myself in the context of this is to what extent these types of decisions are about ideology and to what extent they link back to psychology. So I think a lot of these leaders have an inability to judge how dangerous things could be for their regime because they are so full of themselves that they vastly overestimate their capacity. I think some of these leaders take so many risks, not consciously, but because they simply don't see them as these big risks, because they think they're so strong and they've stayed in power for so long that they've gotten away with so much that they can also get away with this. So sometimes I sort of wonder, is this a conscious decision to risk regime stability for something else that they want? Or do they over time simply lose that ability to make that type of calculation? And I think that's a particularly interesting question when you look at leaders that have either been in power for a long time or leaders that have grown up in power. So when you look at somebody like Kim Jong-un, I've got a quote in the book where a journalist says, "Most of us are the center of attention and the center of the universe as we grow up. But then as we get older, that stops being the case and we're just normal people." But for somebody like Kim Jong-un, that's just never stopped. Under those conditions, or if you stayed in power for a long time, surrounded by these yes men, might you simply overestimate your ability?
Sticking with Libya, you start your excellent and very readable book, How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive, with a Libya story. Oh my God. So mega orderers who want to find out more about Libya, read my book. But mega orderers who want to have a little cute story about Libya, you can read Marcel's book. And he talks about this story of Qadhafi's golden gun. And you coin what you call the golden gun paradox. I think that this is very clever. Could you tell us what, pray tell, is the golden gun paradox?
When we look at these regimes from the comfort of our liberal democracies, and we see these leaders, surrounded by these soldiers, by these tanks, and by all these men with their truncheons and their bayonets, I think we often have this impression that these leaders are almost omnipotent, that they hold absolute power, and that they can do whatever they want to do simply by snapping their finger. But I think in reality, much of what these leaders have is this impression of invincibility and this impression of power, but it isn't actually real. It's a charade, it's an illusion. And when there's ever a moment at which that power is being questioned, all these things that they have, all the bayonets, all the tanks, all the guns, effectively become useless because at that moment when you would actually need to use these weapons to stay in power, all of these regimes tend to be incredibly brittle. And that's what I describe as the golden gun paradox. So Qadhafi had, all the symbols of power, but then when he actually needed it, it couldn't save him.
I agree with this in general, just not about Qadhafi. I love the idea of the golden gun paradox because I think it hits at an essential truth. The Saudis spend $20 bazillion on tanks, planes. They could have nuclear if they wanted to, and everything, and McKinsey consultants and training from the best private mercenary firms, all of that, right? But if 3 or 4 of Mohammed bin Salman's cousins said, you know what, he imprisoned our uncle and took away his money, we just want him out of power, none of that will help because when they're at some dinner with him, they just take him out of power. So 100% believe in the golden gun paradox. I don't know if it applies to Qadhafi because the core of the regime, the Khamis Brigade, that's the 32nd Brigade, the other aspects of the Praetorian Guard all fought for him. They would have won and defeated the rebels. And therefore the tanks and the ideology and the this and the that, it worked. He didn't bank on the fact that the Arab League would ask the UN to enforce a no-fly zone. And therefore, it wasn't that he didn't have his golden gun. He did. He had all the support of very carefully crafted internal secret service police and then the, as I mentioned, the 32nd, sometimes called the Khamis Brigade, and it all worked. And they pushed back the rebel counteroffensive, and the gains that were made in late February were all reversed. I think that saying that he faced the golden gun paradox is not correct.
I'd say 2 things about that. The first thing I'd say is that obviously there was a lot of opposition to Qadhafi in Libya, hence why he got this problem in the first place. And part of that is obviously about the structure of the regime and the way that he governed. And the other thing that I would say is that when it comes to this international dimension, whether it be the Arabs or whether it be NATO, in my mind, that's also related to the type of regime that he led and the type of man that Qadhafi was, right? I mean, like NATO wouldn't have imposed a no-fly zone if Libya were governed like Switzerland, right? So I take the point that much of the security forces kept by him and kept supporting him. But I think ultimately the reason that he fell is still because of the type of the regime that he led.
Again, 100%, and that's all clear. Only 15 to 20% of the population when the Arab Spring started actually supported Qadhafi. However, 15% and all the elite battalions, the golden gun as it were, did try to defend the regime. And I think that that's kind of critical. And Libyans don't want to accept this because it's very, very convenient to say no one really supported Qadhafi. That's unfortunately not true.
And I think that perception or, trying to make it look that way is also quite common after these types of regimes. Because, oftentimes you have this type of tipping point where people then either actually stop supporting the dictator, but at the very least, when that dictator has fallen, then they then say, well, I never really supported the dictator. Of course not. I was different. It's not like that.
So with our agreeable disagreements out of the way, please join us after the break as we order the disorder.
Excuse me, can you take a photo of me?
Sure, but if you had the new Samsung Galaxy Z Flip 6, you could snap your own hands-free selfies.
Really?
Watch. I just flex it to the perfect angle, set it down, and FlexCam with Galaxy AI automatically zooms for the perfect shot.
Whoa.
Post-worthy.
New profile pic-worthy.
Flex the newest Galaxy AI foldable Z Flip 6. Get yours now at Samsung.com. Samsung account login required. FlexCam length varies and is shorter than standard zoom length. Galaxy AI provided free until end of 2025 on supported devices.
The family that vacations together stays together. At least that was the plan. Except now the dastardly desk clerk is saying he can't confirm your connecting rooms.
Wait, what?
That's right, ma'am. You have rooms 201 and 709.
No, we cannot be 5 floors away from our kids.
The doors have double locks. They'll be fine.
When you want your connecting rooms confirmed before you arrive, it matters where you stay.
Welcome to Hilton. I see your connecting rooms are already confirmed.
Hilton, for the stay.
Looking to invest? Start your journey by exploring exchange-traded funds with Global X ETFs. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs for short, create baskets of stocks, bonds, and other assets that you can buy in a single trade. Global X specializes in ETFs that track emerging trends, like the rise of artificial intelligence, as well as strategies aimed to generate income potential. Visit globalxetfs.com to discover how you can get started.
We're back with Marcel Dirsus, and we are going to try to order the disorder. Marcel, how does your analysis of the core principles of tyranny and how they fall give us insights into the following 2 questions? 1, how we can work with tyrannies when we need to on issues of global order like climate change or tax havens, and 2, how Democrats can try to rid the world of tyrannies and have more democracies.
In cases where we absolutely need to cooperate with tyrannies, because we judge our cooperation to lead to some greater good, I think we have to focus on what is best not for the population at large in those countries, but what is best for the leadership. Because as we've just discussed, these regimes are very much focused on regime survival. So the incentives that would work with other democracies might not work with these types of regimes. So if we want to have leverage, if we want to convince them to do something that they might not want to do, but we need it to happen, we need to focus on the elites, not the people at large.
What if we had a defector prize? If you were a defector from, and the problem in Russia is a lot of the key regime people are already very, very wealthy and have reasonably good lives, but let's say it was targeting more African or other systems. If you could escape to the British embassy and you were a key defector, like in the Cold War, we did do this, but I'm saying for now, you got not just citizenship in the US or the EU or the UK, But you got a house and a reasonable life and a new identity so that no one could know who you were and you couldn't easily be assassinated by the goons from your regime. Would that maybe help some of these key members of the selectorate defect? And now, because we don't see ourselves in an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, maybe we don't do a great job cultivating defectors like we once did.
I think when it comes to toppling tyrants, the pressing reality is that the closer you are to power, the more influence you tend to have. So that means that a shopkeeper somewhere in the hinterland is going to have less power than, a regime official in the capital. But obviously, foreign powers can play a large role in bringing down these people. And the way to look at that is to essentially see these dictatorships in three groups. So you have the incumbent, you have the elites that keep him in power, and you have the masses. And if from the outside you want to contribute to toppling the dictator, you need to put pressure on the incumbent, strengthen the elites, and help to mobilize the masses. Because what you want is not just for the elites to take out the dictator, but you want to ensure in an ideal scenario that the old dictator doesn't simply get replaced by a new one. And in order to do that, you need to empower the masses, because a lot of the regime elites are not going to be interested in creating democracy as much as they're going to be interested in continuing the regime with a new figurehead. So if you want a sustainable outcome, if you want to create a liberal democracy, you need to focus on the masses, even though the masses might not be the actor that brings down the dictator.
Okay, that's one way to order the disorder. What about my idea of allowing defectors to come to the US or UK or EU embassies and really setting them up very, very well, even if we are not in a geopolitical struggle with, say, a given country in Africa, but we want to cultivate that people turn on their dictators?
It's a tough pill to swallow because obviously a lot of these people will have done horrific things in order to keep the regime in power, but it's something we should definitely consider, in my opinion. Because, again, if we want to bring down these regimes, it is going to be difficult to stick within the constraints that we have imposed on ourselves. We're going to need to do some unusual things, and we can't have everything at once. So, yeah, I think that's something that we should definitely explore.
Now, you're something of a tyrannologist, I would argue, Marcel, and you're speaking to a disorderologist. So how do tyrannical systems actually work? What impact do they have on global disorder? And if you were king for a day, what institution would you create to deal with tyranny and what you've learned through your research?
I think tyranny will inevitably have an impact on the global disorder because I think tyrants thrive on disorder abroad. I think to the extent that they care about international politics, it's mostly about the way that it helps them keep in power. And the international order that democracies want to uphold, by and large, is a threat to them. So if they can, they will often take a sledgehammer to it, or at least try to do so. If I were king, hopefully not a tyrant, so to speak, and I could institute any institution, I'm not sure that institutions are actually going to save us. I think another one of the uncomfortable truths that we've already discussed is that much of this is related to strength. I think there's a perception, at least in Germany, that we just need more international law, that we need more United Nations. And if we do those things and if we support them and they become stronger, we're going to have fewer problems. I think since these regimes are so focused on strength, really what we need to do is to do a better job of constraining them. And I think the way to constrain them is not through some institution, but it's through power.
Wow. You're speaking truth to power, my man. And we will end on that note. You heard it here first. Speak truth to power. Make the tyrants less powerful. Make the democracies and the orderers more powerful. Great to have you on the program, Marcel.
Thank you very much for having me.
We have a special bonus episode coming out September 19th for our 1-year anniversary since the launch of the one, the only, the Great Disorder podcast. So if you would like to hear some of our favorite interviews with guests and hear how Alex and my life have changed since we have been doing this pod and who we see as the main orderers and disorderers on the world stage, please tune in for that special episode. As always, our producer has been the one, the only, the mega orderer and tyrant fighter, George McDonough. Our executive producer is Neil Fern. If you enjoyed today's program, please follow the link in the show notes where you can find out more about Marcel's amazing book, How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive. Click the link to subscribe to my Substack, where we're going to share some of Marcel's writings and some of his thoughts about other aspects of dictatorship and the global system. And we hope you have a tyrant-free and orderly week.